Hi everybody, this is Unit 7, the muscles. We are going to talk about the function of muscles, the structure, how muscles contract and relax, how muscles store, get, and use energy. We'll talk a little bit about anaerobic versus aerobic exercise and how muscles act differently, how muscles work, and then identifying the muscles themselves is mostly, again, a lab activity, but the end of this show has some images for all the muscles on your master list. Remember from the tissue chapter, or the tissue unit, that there are three types of muscle: smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle is found in organs like your stomach, your bladder. It is not under voluntary control. You don't control this at all. Your vessels, esophagus, squeeze when needed. Cardiac muscle is found in the heart. It also is involuntary. You don't control the beat of your heart. And last is skeletal muscle, which is what this unit is mostly going to focus on, because this is the one that's voluntary. We're going to talk about how muscle contraction occurs, and when we do that, we're really talking about skeletal muscle. Muscle itself is attached to the bones via tendons. Remember, ligaments attach bones to bones, but tendons attach muscles to bones. Muscles are in groups or hunks. You can kind of think of like a drumstick on a chicken. There's different sections of that muscle will pull off individually, and then within that muscle there are bundles of muscle fibers called fasciculi. And you can even pull those apart on sometimes when you eat meat, which might be gross to think about, but it's kind of cool. Those little bundles, again, are fasciculi, and they're wrapped with connective tissue. Inside the muscle bundles are the muscle cells, and muscle cells are usually referred to as muscle fibers. Okay, so when I say muscle fiber, it's the same thing as a muscle cell. They're very, very long. So you couldn't see even a single muscle cell, on a microscope, because they can be the length of the muscle. There's some fancy words or different vocabulary to describe the parts of a muscle cell. It has a phospholipid bilayer membrane, just like we talked about, but it's referred to as the sarcolemma rather than just the cell membrane. So a muscle fiber, the sarcolemma, is the membrane. The cytoplasm is called the sarcoplasm, and the endoplasmic reticulum is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So sarco, you should, when you hear that word, should be reminded of muscles. There's lots of mitochondria in muscles, more if you exercise. Remember, mitochondria are where the ATP is made, so if you want that muscle to contract, you need lots of energy to do that. So the more mitochondria, the better. There's multiple nuclei in a muscle. You need lots of DNA or lots of copies of the DNA to make muscle proteins. And remember, this muscle fiber can be very long, so having just one nucleus wouldn't be enough. The muscle fibers contain myofibrils, which are the proteins that are involved in contraction. The main two are actin and myosin. So actin and myosin are going to bind to each other and pull, and that's what's going to cause the contraction. Myofibrils are muscle fiber proteins involved in contraction. They are arranged in a very orderly, organized fashion called sarcomeres, which by definition is the smallest contractile unit in a muscle fiber. And because of the way the actin and myosin line up, when you stain this cell and look at it under a microscope, it looks like there's lines in it. We call it striations, but what it is just the actin and myosin lined up. In this picture, the top one is an electron micrograph picture, but the bottom part, from Z line to Z line, the actin is in red and is thin, and the myosin is in blue and is thicker. Sometimes they're called the thin filaments and the thick filaments. But that is the actin and myosin, and they're arranged in that order. So when you, again, stain it, the Z lines get dark, then there's a lighter area, and then a darker area where the myosin is. And that alternate dark light pattern makes it look like the muscle is striated. From Z-line to Z-line is 1 sarcomere, which again is the smallest contractile unit in a muscle fiber. So muscle contraction, how does it work? I'm going to give you the basic steps. Obviously there's a lot more detail to this, and there's a couple of animations you can watch that will talk about this in more detail, and of course you get it in more detail in AMP1 if you're going on. But in general, muscle contraction starts with a nerve impulse from a motor neuron. So you want to move skeletal muscle, it's under voluntary control. You're going to initiate that from your brain. Your brain sends a message to the motor neuron, and that's attached to the sarcolemma, and at that attachment point it releases a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter released to induce muscle contraction is ACH, or acetylcholine. Okay, and you can see that in this top picture here. This green thing at the top with the little vesicles contains ACH. ACH is released upon that impulse coming down that axon, goes into the little space there, and it binds receptors on the sarcolemma. That causes a change in charge to happen. Sodium rushes in, makes the inside more positive. That increased positivity inside causes calcium, stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, to flood into the cytoplasm or the sarcoplasm of the cell. Calcium release starts the next step. This picture, the green bead-like things here is the actin, and the purple thing is the myosin. Actin is wrapped by another protein called troponin, and calcium binds that and pulls it away, kind of unwraps the actin, and that allows the myosin to reach up and attach. So calcium pulls away the troponin, troponin and tropomyosin both actually, and allows the actin and myosin to bind, pull, and contract. So the 4 steps of muscle contraction. ACH is released, causes depolarization of the membrane. Calcium comes out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum inside the muscle fiber, which pulls away the troponin from the actin, which allows the actin and myosin to bind. Okay, so in order for a muscle to contract, you're going to need an impulse, okay? And if the motor neuron is damaged, none of this is going to work. Polio, for example, damages motor neurons, and so people who had polio, they couldn't send an impulse to the skeletal muscles. The skeletal muscle probably was just fine, but you couldn't make it contract without that motor neuron. You need the neurotransmitter ACH, and that very rarely would people be missing that. However, nerve gas, botulism toxin, and the tetanus toxin can interfere with that part, which can lead to failure for muscles to either contract or relax. The third thing you need is calcium. You get this from your diet, of course, but without calcium, you're not going to have muscle contraction. On the other hand, if you had too much calcium, it can cause spasmodic contractions, or what we call a Charlie horse. And you need energy. You need ATP. All those mitochondria that are present in muscle fibers, very important. So without any of these, or without any one of these, muscle contraction cannot happen. Here's a picture of a bunch of muscle fibers in red there, and you can see the little striations. And this black string-like thing is the motor neuron, and the spots or the black dots there are where it's attached to each muscle fiber. So if an impulse comes along, any fiber attached to that neuron is going to contract. Calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum inside the muscle fiber during contraction, and again it allows for that actin to bind to myosin because it pulls away the troponin. And again, without calcium this would not work. You can imagine, like I said a few seconds ago, what happens when there's not enough? You're not going to have contraction. If there's too much, you'll have contraction even or the contraction will hold longer than expected, causing that Charlie horse thing to happen. It can be very painful. ATP is used for 3 different steps of muscle contraction. It primes the myosin. Basically, it gets it ready to reach up and bind actin. It allows the release of actin from myosin so the muscle can relax so you can contract again, for example, if you're flexing and extending your arm. And it also allows for calcium to be put back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You got to pump it back in there with active transport pumps in order to set up the whole thing again if you want to contract that muscle. When you run out of ATP, muscle contraction will stop. If you run out of ATP because you die, you get rigor mortis, and the reason is bullet point number 2 there. Without ATP, the myosin won't release from actin and it holds, which is why people or animals, when they die, at first their muscles won't relax. After a few minutes, you're not going to make any more ATP in the muscles, of course, because you're not alive, and it causes rigor mortis. A few days later, when the body isn't rigid, or a few hours later, it's because the muscle cells are starting to disintegrate, not because you got ATP back. Anyway, the reasons for rigor mortis is running out of ATP. So when you want to relax a muscle, you got to put that ACH back. The acetylcholine has to go back from the space and the receptors on the sarcolemma back into the neuron. You have an enzyme that does this called acetylcholinesterase, which is a really long word, so it's kind of cool to say. Acetylcholinesterase removes ACH from the receptors and it's recycled back to the neuron. You also need to return the calcium into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That's an active transport process. Again, requires ATP. And the myosin and actin let go and the muscle fiber relaxes. Okay, you can see that in this picture as well. The top one is relaxed, the bottom one is contracted. Notice the Z lines got closer together during contraction, or if you go from the bottom picture to the top picture, the Z lines get further apart during relaxation. Actin and myosin itself doesn't change or disintegrate. You can see that the length of the actin and the length of the myosin is actually the same. It's just they're not attached as closely together. Both of the two animation links here are excellent at explaining muscle contraction. I'd highly recommend you go back to the original PowerPoint and watch those two. Doing this takes an incredible amount of energy. You need a lot of ATP to contract muscle. And so where are you going to get all that ATP? Remember, cellular respiration and the mitochondria in the muscle fiber are there and ready and waiting, but what do you need to do cellular respiration? You need sugar. Okay, sugar is the favorite molecule for a cell to make ATP out of, and eating food, particularly sugar, is a very popular way to get energy to your muscles. Even people or athletes, they used to think giving them sugar right before a race, like a candy bar, would help. Now it's give them sugar the night before so they can stock up their muscles. Remember the 3 steps of cellular respiration: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, which is labeled TCA in this picture, and then the electron transport system. Remember that glycolysis only gets you 2 ATP, but you don't need any oxygen. But when oxygen's around, pyruvate is converted to acetyl-CoA. It goes into the mitochondria, goes through the Krebs cycle, and electron transport, and you get like 30 more ATP. So really, having oxygen is the way to go. Okay, it generates enough ATP to keep muscle contraction going. But you need oxygen. There are some things in muscle fibers that help this. You do have a little bit of ATP hanging around in your muscles, but really that only gives you about 2 seconds worth of time of contraction. So you can jerk back 1 or 2 times that bicep muscle with the existing ATP. So to help the situation out, you have creatine phosphate, which is a molecule that stores ATP. You've probably heard of creatine supplements. Sometimes this is a supplement sold with the idea that if you ate it, you'd have extra in your muscle to store ATP. The problem is it's a protein and it's going to be digested just like eggs and steak will be, and whether it will be converted back to creatine is not for certain. There is some research that suggests that creatine, when consumed by athletes, can be somewhat helpful. Another thing that you have in muscle fibers that help is myoglobin. Myoglobin is a protein that can store oxygen. And if you have more oxygen, you can do the Krebs cycle, electron transport faster, generate more ATP. Muscles can also store glycogen. Glycogen is the way our tissues store glucose. So the night before you had spaghetti and potatoes, you converted all that sugar that came from those items in the muscle. It was converted to glycogen, and it's sitting there regular in little packets waiting for you to need it. Okay, so it's sometimes referred to as glycogen loading or carb storing. It's our way, or our muscle cells' way of getting ready for contraction. The other thing, of course, is muscle fibers have a lot of mitochondria, and you can actually get more mitochondria in muscle fibers if you move. Okay, any muscle you exercise will build or make more mitochondria, and muscles that you don't use, the mitochondria go away. So you got to keep on exercising if you want that mitochondria numbers to stay high. So if you have all these things, you have 2 seconds of existing ATP. Creatine phosphate can store another 17 seconds. If you have glucose and oxygen around, you can add 130 seconds worth of ATP. And so hopefully that will be enough to keep your muscles going long enough to do whatever it is you need to do. Okay. The next picture kind of summarizes on the left side what we just talked about. With oxygen, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport, you end up with 30 ATP for every molecule of glucose. So as long as you're breathing, you're not doing exercise really fast or anything, but you're walking or working in the kitchen or vacuuming your rug or whatever, that is enough to keep you going because you're breathing. Oxygen's always being replenished, carbon dioxide's being taken away, etc. That's aerobic respiration because you're getting enough oxygen to keep contraction going. If, however, you're pumping iron really fast or running a marathon and you've been going a while, you can't breathe fast enough to get enough oxygen to those muscle fibers. When there's no oxygen around, you can only do glycolysis. And the pyruvate at the end of glycolysis is converted to lactic acid because you don't have enough oxygen to do the Krebs cycle, electron transport. Now you have lactic acid built up in your muscles, and eventually that's going to cause your proteins to unfold because remember, acids break hydrogen bonds and your proteins will denature. At some point, that muscle will stop contracting completely. Okay, and you've probably heard it at a gym when people are doing anaerobic exercise. Go until you feel the burn. Literally what you're feeling is acid burn inside those muscle fibers. You get to complete exhaustion and the bodybuilder will stop and walk around and kind of shake his or her arms to get oxygen and blood flow going back into those tissues to get rid of the lactic acid. When your muscles stop contracting because you've run out of oxygen, it's called muscle fatigue. Because as soon as you run out of oxygen, at that point you're not going to be able to make any more ATP and the muscles just aren't going to contract. Sometimes marathon runners will collapse because they have so much lactic acid that none of their muscles will keep working. So now you're in oxygen debt, and the amount of oxygen that you need to recover includes enough to get your lactic acid reverted to pyruvate, which your liver can do, restore normal glucose, myoglobin, creatine phosphate, and ATP levels to normal. Okay, that amount of oxygen is your oxygen debt, and until you do that, your muscles will not contract. Okay, there's no more oxygen, there's too much lactic acid around for contraction to happen. Sometimes you can have muscle fatigue because of a lack of ACH, but again, that is pretty rare. Okay, so basically you lay down or sit there and you breathe rapidly until this is restored. Sometimes when you're sore after a workout, it's because that lactic acid is still damaging your muscles, or the muscle fibers have been damaged and have to be repaired, and that could take a day or two. But generally, what happens is that causes your muscles to get bigger. Weirdly, the way to get bigger muscles is to damage them. And so you have to work out and cause some damage, so when the repair happens, you get bigger, better muscles, more mitochondria, so the next time you can lift a little more weight or run a little farther. Muscle metabolism of glucose generates quite a bit of heat, which is good. This helps maintain our body temperature. As blood flows by the muscle, it takes away some of that warmth and spreads it throughout the rest of the body. So it's a perfect example of why you start doing jumping jacks or jumping up and down when you're cold, because muscle metabolism generates heat. Okay? The blood carries the heat throughout the body to maintain body temperature. Okay, so that's pretty much skeletal muscle contraction. Smooth muscle and cardiac muscle also contract. It's almost identical. There's just some slight differences between the two. Obviously, cardiac and smooth muscle is involuntary, so you don't control this. Smooth muscle contraction can be initiated by neurotransmitters, just like skeletal muscle is initiated by the neurotransmitter ACH. But smooth muscle can contract also due to hormones, and sometimes due to stretching. Stretching of the uterus, for example. They think that when a baby gets big enough, it stretches the smooth muscle of the uterine wall to the point where it initiates contraction. Oxytocin is another hormone that's used to initiate labor or induce labor, and that's not a neurotransmitter, it's a hormone. So contraction is similar, but it can be started by different things than skeletal muscle contraction. Contraction in smooth muscle also can happen slower. I mean, think how fast you jerk away from something that is painful, or when you step on a tack or something. Smooth muscle contraction generally isn't that quick, but it can be held longer. So if you've ever had a baby, you probably understand this. Labor or contractions can sometimes last, a minute, versus a muscle contraction which might only last a couple of seconds. In your heart, muscle contraction again is pretty similar. Calcium plays a very important role in heart muscle contraction. Not only is calcium released inside from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, just like we talked about, but it's also the ion that causes depolarization of the membrane. It's sodium in skeletal muscle contraction, it's calcium in cardiac contraction. In fact, one of the ways we slow down people's heart rate is give them calcium channel blockers. There's no sustained or tectonic contractions in cardiac muscle. You can't hold a contraction. Like if you were holding a book, you could hold it for several minutes maybe before your muscle would relax. You don't want that to happen in the heart. You need the heart to contract and then relax so it can fill up full of blood again, and then contract to push the blood out, and then relax. So you can't, we were designed so you can't have a contraction that holds in cardiac muscle. So all the fibers contract at once, then all relax at once. It's a uniform thing when it comes to cardiac muscle contraction. All right, so that pretty much sums up contraction of the muscles. Some of the rest of the slides here are going to talk more about skeletal muscle and the anatomy. Okay, so a couple of words for you, some definitions before I show you the muscles. All skeletal muscles are attached to bones by the tendons. And the tendons are connective tissue and allows that muscle to, when it contracts, it gets shorter. When it relaxes, it gets longer. And that allows movement because the attachments, the tendons that are attached to the bones, are attached to the immovable bone at one end, referred to as the origin, and attached to another bone called the insertion, and that's the one that moves. So in this picture right here, the biceps muscle, the origin, the tendon attached up at the top to the scapula is the origin, and the attachment down at the bottom is to the radius. And when the muscle gets short or contracts, the insertion bone, whatever bone the insertion is, end of the tendon is attached to, is the one that moves. So if you think about it, when you flex your arm, the lower arm moves closer to the upper arm. Okay? The scapula doesn't move, but the radius does. So the origin is the attachment point of the bone that doesn't move, and the insertion is the attachment of the bone that does move. The muscle that's used most for a particular movement is called the prime mover. Flexion of the arm is done mostly by the biceps muscle. So the biceps is the prime mover. Any other smaller muscles that do the same thing but aren't as big as the prime mover are called the synergistic muscles. So the brachialis muscle and some of the other brachioradialis a little bit, those are smaller muscles in the arm that are also involved in flexion or bending your elbow. The muscle that has to relax when the prime mover contracts is called the antagonistic muscle. And in this case, the triceps muscle, the one on the back of your arm, has to relax when the biceps contracts. And then when the triceps contracts, that would be the prime mover for extension, then the bicep has to relax, and now the bicep muscle becomes the antagonistic muscle. Okay, so the antagonistic muscle is just the opposite one of the prime mover. All right, the rest of the slides in this PowerPoint, just identify the muscles on your master list, so you can flip through these at your own speed to look at which ones you need to know. Again, make sure you consult the master list in your lab book. So here's a diagram of most of the muscles on your list. Some of them aren't even, some of these are even extra. There are 600 muscles, but I think there's maybe 20 on your list. Here are the skull muscles, upper arm muscles, thoracic muscles or upper chest muscles, upper arm, biceps, brachialis, and brachioradialis, lower arm muscle, your back muscles, abdominal muscles, some more back muscles, front leg muscles. Your quads are the front leg muscles, and your hamstrings are the back of your thigh. And that is the end of the muscle PowerPoint. Make sure you do your reading assignment and check out Canvas for other links that might help you. And you can always email me if you have questions.